Happy Easter, everyone. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Welcome to our final session of Following to the Cross, Mark chapters 11 through 16 on this Easter Sunday. Um, Timed it, I guess you could say, well, to finish on Easter with the resurrection passage from Mark's Gospel. So we'll just kind of dive right in because the end of Mark's Gospel is kind of strange, and yet it wraps up for us all the themes that we have seen Mark the evangelist developing for us as we walk through this text. So we'll pick up at the end of chapter 15 at the burial and continue on through the end, as we'll see at verse 8. So again, the focus here is completely and entirely on Jesus on the cross. 3 times in Mark's Gospel in chapters 8, 9, and 10, Jesus had predicted his death when he got to Jerusalem. We had the entirety of chapters 11 through 15 focused on Jesus' time in Jerusalem leading up to the crucifixion. And we saw last week how someone finally, for the first time, recognizes Jesus for who he is, that is, as the Son of God, as he's hanging on the cross. So in verse 39, the confession of the centurion, truly this man was the Son of God, and that sets up the end of the story. Now, 2 things are going to happen here that are a bit unusual, to say the least. First thing is historical. And I alluded to this in earlier sessions, but I want to emphasize here again that in Roman society in the first century AD and on until crucifixion was banned as a form of capital punishment in the 4th century, through that entire time in Roman culture, there is never, ever a single time where there's a positive description of crucifixion. So in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus says for the first time that he will be crucified, and Peter says, it's not going to happen, that's not a surprising response from Peter because no one ever says that will happen. Sorry, there's some sirens going outside, so don't mind the sirens. There's never a positive description of crucifixion. It's never seen as a positive event. In fact, I'd like to read to you a few quotes from a Roman writer and politician, philosopher named Cicero, who lived about 60 plus years before Jesus. Cicero, a couple of quotes: crucifixion is a most cruel and disgusting punishment. Another quote: it is the worst extreme of the tortures inflicted upon slaves. And that's a key emphasis. It's a punishment inflicted upon slaves. And finally, he says this about crucifixion. He says, to bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him, an abomination. To slay him is an act of murder. To crucify him is what? There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed. So for Cicero, punishment of a Roman citizen was unthinkable. Binding is a crime, flogging an abomination, slaying an act of murder, but crucifixion, cannot even mention it. Yet all of these happened to Jesus. And all of these are seen as positive. Jesus predicted that he would go there and willingly went there to accomplish his work. And on that cross, crucified as only a slave would be, he is recognized as the Son of God. So that's the first thing that never happened before, that we see here in Mark's gospel. The second thing that never happened before, well, it's fairly obvious. Somebody bodily rose from the dead, right? Somebody resurrected, right? Not simply resuscitated. Jesus did that. He raised the widow's son at the funeral, right? In John's gospel, he raises Lazarus, but they would die again. Resurrection is a completely different thing. He's risen and transformed into something that never existed before. That's 1 Corinthians 15. We don't have that text for us to study today, but here in Mark's gospel, these two things happen for the first time. Crucifixion is positive, and somebody rises from the dead. Now, as you recall our checklist of things that Jesus said he would do, I hate to keep reminding you, but this is a really important point. All these things that Jesus said would happen have happened. Starting from 14:1 onward, we'll pick up a few later on that occurred earlier, but the two that remain are critical. First, in 14:25, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. And the second one to watch out for, after I am raised up, I will go before you into Galilee. Again, that seemingly inane, useless statement tucked into the middle of all these predictions about the disciples fleeing at the Last Supper is this prediction that they will see him after he is raised up in Galilee. So wait to see if we tick off any of those boxes here today. The burial of Jesus, then, in verses 40 and following. First, I'd like you to notice that, again, if you just look visually at the text, you have verse 40 to 47. You got a pretty good chunk of text just describing the women who followed from Jerusalem. They served him, they took care of him, they ministered to him, is what the ESV says, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So, as you recall, we've had these sort of minor characters who pop into the gospel occasionally and always do the right thing. They always respond properly to Jesus. The last person we saw was Simon of Cyrene, who was forced to pick up Jesus' cross and follow him. Exactly what Jesus calls disciples to do. Well, here now we find this whole crowd of women who are doing what the disciples couldn't even do. They've been there all along in the background, and they've not fled. They've not run away. They've not abandoned Jesus. So, is this a sign of positive things, right? And then the burial. Um, we hear about Joseph of Arimathea. Again, he just pops in out of the middle of nowhere. This minor character who goes. He says he took courage, went to Pilate, and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate is surprised that he's already dead. Uh, he checked with the centurion, verse 45, and he granted the body to Jesus, or to Joseph, sorry. You get the shroud. They put him in the tomb cut out of rock. And Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So, really long section of text, 8 verses, just to describe Jesus getting from the cross into the tomb. And all we get for the resurrection is 8 verses. And again, come on, Mark, why are you focusing on things that seem so minor and not putting attention on the things that seem so major? Well, again, it's because he wants us to pay attention to these characters, these people who pop in, right? Who understands Jesus? Who confesses him as he truly is? Who follows him in the way that he is called? And maybe, finally, maybe we have some candidates for the perfect followers of Jesus, these women who it seems have done everything exactly right. Now, the burial, just a little background on the burial practices of the Jewish population in Judea in the first century. What's described here is entirely in keeping with what you would expect from a first century burial. The image on the screen there is of modern day Mount of Olives, and you can see the tombs there. In the present day, in Jesus' day, the Mount of Olives hillside was also a location for tombs and graves. And if you go to Jerusalem, you'll be shown similar sorts of things. This is an example. It's called Herod's tomb. I don't really know whose it is, but um, obviously an important tomb because it's very ornate and substantial. But notice a couple of things that should look familiar. You've got the opening, you've got the stone that would be rolled in front of the opening to seal the tomb, but the stone could also be rolled away so that the family could come back with spices, which we'll see in chapter 16. The typical practice would have been to, as described in the end of chapter 15, take the body, wrap it in cloth, put spices in it, put it into the tomb. Notice, though, no mention in chapter 15 about the spices. So that sets up chapter 16 for the women to come back after the Sabbath is completed to add spices to the body. The reason they would do this is because, and you see the rendering there, the drawing, the body would have been placed on a kind of a platform in the cloth with spices so that the flesh could decompose. And then about a year later, the family would come back, gather the bones, and place them in the ossuaries in a family crypt, as you see depicted here. Entirely in keeping with Jewish burial practices in the first century, exactly described as you see it in the Gospels. Again, the key point at the end of verse 15 or chapter 15 is women who need to finish what has not been completed. Um, you remember the women in chapter 14 who anointed Jesus' body for burial? It actually had been finished, right? Jesus said that story would be told about her uh, uh, as in remembrance of her. But the women don't know that apparently. They plan to come back and put the spices on the body, as is the typical burial practice. So again, let's look at our groupings, right? We have no disciples left. They're all gone. But these random people pop back into the story. And hopefully someone will get it right. Well, let's go to chapter 16. Is this the end? I want to read through this kind of carefully and pick out some details as we go. So I'm going to kind of refer to my notes, and I'm actually for this section I haven't done this, but I want to track through the Greek here because there's some interesting phraseology in Greek that you can't necessarily pick up in the English. So 16 verse 1. After the Sabbath had been completed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome purchased spices in order that having gone out, they might anoint him. A couple of details. Jesus was crucified, as you recall, on a Friday morning. Saturday is the Passover, so no work on that day in keeping with the command from Exodus. When the Sabbath is completed in the Jewish way of counting days is actually sundown on Saturday. So sundown begins the day, and the next morning is part of the previous day. So Jesus dies on a Friday. His body is taken down before the Sabbath. He's in the tomb for all of Saturday. On Saturday night, what we would call Saturday night, after the conclusion of Sabbath, the women go to the shops, which are now reopened because the Sabbath is over. The gas station reopens or whatever, and they get the spices. Okay, so the women think they're going to find a dead body. Now, remember, 3 times Jesus said that he would die, that he would be crucified, that he would rise again. He told us again to the disciples in the upper room that he was going to rise again. When the women see Jesus placed into a grave and go out specifically to purchase spices, they are expecting to find a dead body. They are not expecting a resurrection, at least not at this point, right? So, verse 2. And exceedingly early on the first day of the week, they come upon the place at the rising of the sun. They came upon the tomb at the rising of the sun. So again, Mark kind of piles up some descriptors to get this very early in the morning. You kind of get that mood set of that barely light, and the women are arriving at this unusual hour, right? Very still, very quiet, almost mysterious. Verse 3, we then get to eavesdrop on their conversation. And they kept on saying to themselves or amongst themselves, and that verb tense is intentional. This is kind of the topic of conversation on the way from Jerusalem to the tomb, or perhaps from Bethany to the tomb. Mark doesn't tell us, but anyway, they're on their way to the tomb. They kept on saying, "Who will roll away for us the stone from the door of the tomb?" Not a very good plan, right? They got the spices. They went out the night before to get the spices. Now, early in the morning, they're wondering who's going to roll away the stone. Not a very good plan, right? And and then Mark puts in the kicker. And having looked up, they see that the stone, and let me translate this, the stone is in a state of having been rolled away. Right? It's in a perfect tense in Greek. They see that the stone has been already and still is rolled away. Mark adds parenthetically, for the stone, or for it was exceedingly great, exceedingly large. Now, again, in Greek, you get to play with the word order like this, and Mark kind of throws these in once in a while, these little tailing comments for emphasis. So, verse 3, who's going to roll away the stone? They look up and, see it rolled away. And Mark says, oh, by the way, recall that this is a very large stone. Okay. Not normal activity. Then they get to the tomb. And let me pop the details up here. And they come, and having come into the tomb, they see a young man sitting at the right, clothed in a white garment. And they were, well, terrified. Ekthambeo. But he says to them, well, let me pick up. White robe. Okay. Mark doesn't call him an angel. Uh, in Greek, angelos, the word angel could mean either just a messenger or an angel, an angelic being. Mark makes it clear that this is a heavenly being by what he's wearing, that is, with the white garment. The only other time somebody wears a white garment is Jesus at his transfiguration in chapter 9. And there, Jesus' white garment is exceedingly white, brighter than any bleacher on the earth can bleach it. So Jesus has the amazingly clean white that you see on the TV commercials, and the angel has an extraordinary white, but not the Jesus white. Okay, so he's a heavenly messenger. The women are, your translation would say, amazed. Ekthambeo in Greek is not amazed; they're terrified, right? And so the angel, the messenger, says in verse 6, he says to them, "Stop being terrified." In your King James, it's much more pleasant. Do not be afraid, right? But stop being terrified. You seek Jesus the Nazarene, the crucified one. Let's go over that again. You seek Jesus, the Nazarene, the crucified one. All very important descriptors, right? Nazareth, we heard about all the way back in the first couple of chapters of Mark's Gospel. We hear that Jesus in his hometown is rejected, right, because he's the son of a carpenter. Yet this Jesus, the guy from Nazareth, is the one who was crucified. Make no doubt about that. The centurion saw it. The centurion confessed him as Son of God at the cross. The centurion reported to Pilate that he died on the cross. And so the messenger, the angel, says specifically, this guy, the one that went into the ground Friday afternoon, he was crucified. But what happened to him? He rose. He is not here. Look, the place where they put him. So again, we don't have a video, but he must have been gesturing to something like what you see on the screen, a cloth lying on an empty platform where the body would have been. He rose, he is not here. Look at the place where they put him. Now, we're not quite to the end yet, but I want to pick up in verse 6. That's all we get for the resurrection, right? He rose, he is not here. Look the place where they put him. What do we have? 10 words in Greek. That's all Mark uses to describe Jesus' resurrection. Now, it's not because the resurrection is not important. It's the key event. It's the flip side of the cross. It's what Jesus said he would do 3 times, something that no one had ever done before, and yet here it is happening. So again, it's not that this is not an important event in the gospel. Rather, it's the response to the event that Mark wants us to pick up on. What does this teach us about who Jesus is, what he came to do, and what it means to follow him? So let's see the response in verse 7. However, go say to his disciples and to Peter that he, present tense, is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you. It's a lot more than 10 words in Greek. It's what Mark is trying to get us to learn about discipleship from the resurrection. Is this the end? Well, again, we have 2 events tied together. Here we finally have the event where Jesus snatches away those who are bound by sin and death and the devil. He said this would happen in 2:20 when people were accusing him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul. He said, nope, I'm binding Satan so that I can rescue people. It's where he robs the strong man to take his people back in chapter 3. In the Passion predictions, both his crucifixion and his resurrection are emphasized. You can't have one without the other in Jesus' ministry. And it's the final, ultimate, decisive identification of who Jesus is. The centurion could say he's Son of God based on what he saw on the cross, but there can be no doubt that he's Son of God when he's risen from the dead. That's the ultimate revealing event. He's revealed as the Son of God by his death and resurrection. The details of how Jesus rose, Mark doesn't describe them. You get a few more details in Matthew with the soldiers. John's gospel, of course, you have Mary at the tomb and more things described there. And in Matthew and Luke and John, you get the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. In Mark, all you get is the empty tomb, the resurrection, and the announcement. And the announcement of the resurrection and the reminder of what Jesus had said would happen is what Mark is trying to teach, what he's trying to get us to learn about what it means to be a disciple. So there's a response demanded. Every time there's an action or a saying of Jesus, there's a response expected. And what is expected? Well, there's a command. Go and say or tell his disciples and Peter. So there's a command to go, right? There's a command to go and report this news. Second, it's to the disciples and specifically to Peter. Now, remember, how many disciples are left at this point? There's 0. And who is the last disciple to fail? Even though Jesus warned him it would happen? Well, it was Peter. Peter was the last one off the boat. He's the first one pulled back in. In 1472, Peter is out, and in 1607, he's brought back in. Go and say to his disciples, and in particular to Peter, because he's the last and worst. He failed me 3 times. And the key statement, he is going before you into Galilee, right? If he's going before you, in front of you, that means you are following, right? He goes before you into Galilee. Start heading up there, follow him, right? And there you will see him, just as he said to you. There's that phrase we've seen in Mark, just as he said. Just as he said. He is going, present tense, before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said. And what does seeing mean in Mark's gospel? Well, seeing means to understand. It means to believe. It means to be a follower. So, it looks like the story is all tied up. Jesus kept his promises. He was faithful, even though no one else in the story was faithful. He's restored the disciples. He's restored Peter. We had the women. They've been doing things right all along for the most part. I mean, they still were expecting to find a dead body in the tomb, but, by and large, they seem to be doing okay. So what's their response? Well, it's not that. Verse 8, and having come out from the tomb, they fled because, and let me get this in the Greek, because trembling and astonishment seized them. And the Greek is very particular here. Trembling and astonishment seized them. They were in the grip of fear, literally. And the last line, and they said no thing to no one. Udeni uden. It's great Greek. They said no thing to no one. Why? Because they kept on being afraid. It's an imperfect tense in Greek. They were continuously terrified. They feared. Is this the right response? Well, every time there's fear in the Gospel of Mark, it's a bad thing. The disciples at the calming of the storm, the disciples as they're heading up to Jerusalem. Fear is always the wrong response to what Jesus is doing in Mark's gospel. It's the response of the Gerasenes after the demoniac is cleansed from the demon. And the one who is among the tombs, they asked Jesus to leave them because they were afraid. The women, again, should have known. They've been following Jesus from Galilee, they've been serving him. Even the angel points it out, just as he said to you, right? You, women, heard this prediction that Jesus would go before you into Galilee and there you would see him. Why is it a surprise that the tomb is empty? And why are you terrified? Why are you responding the way that you do? Why don't they know? Well, it's this theme we've seen throughout Mark's gospel. Here, this last great hope, the women who it seems are following Jesus also fall away. There is no one left. No one who saw it coming. No one who responded properly to Jesus' call to follow him. No one who trusted his promise that he would rise from the dead, that they would see him again in Galilee. Even the last great hope, these women who were there all along, unknowingly to us through the story, even they fail in the end. Now, why does Mark's gospel end this way? If you look at the footnotes in your Bible, lots of copyists and lots of readers of Mark's gospel in the history of the church thought this was too hard. And so they added basically a compilation of Matthew and Luke and John and the book of Acts and finished the story so that it did not end so abruptly. I'm showing you one of the early manuscripts that do not have anything after this, which is the way Mark's gospel originally ended. We don't have time to go into details here. Just looking at the screen, you can see the words there, ephobunto gar, for they kept on being afraid. That's it. A couple little flourishes to end the writing, and then kind of mark on Gospel according to Mark. End of story. It's a very rough ending. But it's a rough ending because Mark is teaching us about being a disciple. He's teaching us of how to follow Jesus. And in the end, it seems that no one can follow Jesus. No one remains faithful. As I've mentioned a few times through this study, Mark is almost certainly written for Christians who are facing persecution. We know this was happening in Rome in the 60s of the first century, just a handful of decades after Jesus' death and resurrection. Christians were persecuted for their faith. And we know from the history of the church that this continued down into the 4th century in the Roman Empire, and it continues to happen today around the world. Mark's audience was certainly terrified. They certainly had people who could not make the confession that the centurion did when they were forced to do so before the government authorities, that Jesus was the Son of God. Some people, no doubt, could not remain faithful. What about them? What about those who fail Jesus? What about those who do not do exactly what Jesus has called them to do all the time? It seems in the end that no one is faithful. But does this mean that no one can follow Jesus? Well, the answer comes in that little promise from 14:28, Mark 14:28. I will go before you into Galilee, and there you will see me. It's the promise that Jesus made. And as we see, Jesus is the one who keeps his promises. The theme of seeing in Mark's gospel is an essential theme. He criticized the disciples in chapter 8. Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do not hear? And do you not understand? They're in the boat. Do they not understand the significance of the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, that he was, in fact, the Son of God? Well, apparently in chapter 8, they did not. And apparently in chapter 15, they did not. And in chapter 16, even the women did not see and understand. Now, the centurion did, right? Remember when he saw that in this way Jesus died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Seeing is the proper response. There in Galilee, you will see, you will understand, you will follow Jesus. Jesus keeps his promises. 8:31, 9:31, 10:34, three times he predicts his death and resurrection. It happens exactly as he said. We saw this at the entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. You will find a donkey. It happens. The fig tree will die. It happens. Our checklist that we saw beginning in chapter 14, all these things have happened. And now we can tick off 14:28. After I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. It's happening in Mark chapter 16. Jesus is keeping every promise that he ever made. He is the faithful one, even though none of his followers prove to be faithful. So, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Well, go up to Galilee. His word is certain, his promise is certain. Just as he said to you, he will accomplish what he promised. Even though you are faithless, even though I am faithless, Jesus is faithful. He keeps his promises. He is the one who accomplishes the work, even though we are not able to, even though no one in Mark's gospel is able to. Even those suffering, failing first century Christians who Mark was writing for in the midst of persecution, who perhaps the day before had renounced their faith in Christ, and now we're hearing this message from the evangelist Mark that Jesus is faithful, even though the disciples are not. Go and say to his disciples and to Peter, who denied not once, but three times. Jesus' promises are certain for Peter, they're certain for the 12, and they're certain for the women. In fact, the story kind of does not end here. Well, for two reasons. Those two reasons are, first, Jesus always keeps his promises. Just look at the checklist. Second, because we got the gospel story written down, right? Eventually, those women did go and say to his disciples and Peter that, remember, he was going to meet you in Galilee. They did go and see Jesus. They did understand. Somebody told the story to Mark. Mark wrote it all down, and it now is unfolding. So outside the confines of the gospel, it works. Somebody was able to follow because Jesus kept his word. He himself rose from the dead and he brings back his people. And with that promise, Jesus starts bringing back his people. The 12, the women, everyone who could not follow him in the gospel account are brought back because Jesus proves himself faithful. Jesus keeps his word and he restores and he gathers his people unto himself, all so that they can follow him. Everybody's back. Say to his disciples and Peter, this is spoken to the women. They must have gone on to tell, and Jesus gathers his people together. There they will see him. Kind of looks like church there on the screen, doesn't it? People gathered together by the call of Jesus to follow him as his people. Not because they're awesome or because they keep all the commandments or because they do exactly what Jesus said or because they've proven themselves to be outstanding Christians, but solely because Jesus keeps his promises. He calls and we follow. And when we fail, he calls again and he calls again. And he accomplishes the work that none of us can do solely because of his grace and mercy, solely because he is the Son of God. So we've learned in Mark's gospel that every time somebody fails, the proper response is the right one. When the disciples in the boat, after Jesus calms the storm, say, "Who is this man that even the wind and the sea are obedient to him?" and they're terrified, we know that that's the wrong response. The proper response is, "He's the Son of God, don't be afraid." Right? That's what Jesus says. Why are you cowardly? Do you not yet understand? The opposite response is what's supposed to happen. So when the women flee and don't say anything to anyone, Mark is telling us actually, you should do the opposite. You should follow and you should tell everybody, right? That's why Mark lays it out. That's what the angel says at the tomb. Do the opposite of what all the failures in Mark's gospel do. Follow and tell, right? So now that we know the answers, we can go back to Galilee, go back to the beginning of the gospel. As you recall, the first 8 chapters of Mark's gospel happen only in Galilee and around Galilee as a base, never in Jerusalem, all in Galilee. And in Galilee is where all the miracles happen. That's where Jesus calls the disciples. That's where the calming of the storm happens. That's where the man lowered through the roof is raised up and he walks again and his sins are forgiven. That's where the 5,000 are fed. That's where the 4,000 are fed. That's where the boy who's throwing himself into the fire is cleansed. That's where the woman who touches Jesus' cloak is healed. All the great demonstrations of Jesus' power happen in Galilee. And now that we know the end of the story, we can go back and read them for what they are. They tell us who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God who is faithful to his promises, who is faithful even to people who fail him. And the last command, go and tell. Go and tell. The women ended up going and telling the disciples and Peter, and apparently a lot of other people. And we know again outside of Mark's gospel that this did happen. People told others about Jesus. Mark, the evangelist, is telling people about Jesus. We who now follow Jesus are called to go and tell people about Jesus. Go and tell that this man is the Son of God. So conclude, no one in the gospel story completely or perfectly is there yet, that is following faithfully. No one in the story ever gets there. We may never well get there, but the call remains and fruit is still produced. That is salvation. Jesus remains faithful. Jesus provides for his people. So the rereading of Mark's gospel is as important as the first reading. The book is, in a sense, unfinished. You have to go outside the gospel story to finish it. And in the same way, we ourselves as disciples are unfinished. We are incomplete. We also will fail. We also will turn away. Yet Jesus is faithful. He's faithful to his promises, and he's faithful to us. And he's demonstrated it by his resurrection and by his words. And so we go and tell. Right? We go and tell what Jesus has done. So to pick up from session 1 and those 3 questions. Who is this man? Well, he's the Son of God. Mark 1:1, Mark 15:39. What is he doing? He's going to the cross to give his life as a ransom for many and rising from the dead to give new life. And how do we respond? Daily, we pick up our cross and follow him. Even when we drop it, even when we fail, even when it's cast upon us unwillingly, like Simon of Cyrene, every day we pick it up and follow him. And when we fail that day, tomorrow we pick it up and follow him because he's the faithful one. He's kept his word. He's kept his promises. I'll leave you with 3 models of following Jesus from Mark's gospel. First, service. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. And Mark continues, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus models this service to all people by his death on the cross, by taking the cup that the Father would not let pass from him and fulfilling his word and work for us. So we serve others. Second, we tell. Go tell his disciples and to Peter. If you know of a Peter, someone who has walked away, someone who turned from Jesus, go and tell him. Jesus' promise is certain. His forgiveness, his love is always there. Go ahead, give him a call. Today's Easter. You got an excuse. Go and tell him of Jesus' love. And last, follow. That's a summary of the entire book. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and this good news will save it. Jesus has accomplished this for us. Today, this Lord's Day, this Easter Day, we celebrate that victory. We celebrate the fulfillment of God's promises, and we live in his promises every day. Thanks for trekking through this Bible study. God's blessings as you continue to read and study and follow him. Thanks.